Todd, thank you for that, and thank you for hosting us in your home. To both of you, thank you for your service to our country in uniform, to the state of Iowa in public office, to this community of Charles City, some of whose history you were showing off to me earlier when I was in your office, and so learned a little bit about the history of this really beautiful town that really captured our attention and our imagination as we were coming into town after our previous town hall at Wartburg in Waverly a little bit earlier today. To each of you for taking some time out of your day for what you're doing for this community, some in positions of elected office, others supporting those in elected office or running for elected office, each of whom is trying to make sure that we meet the challenge that Todd just described, this really defining moment of truth for the United States that's going to be the test of all tests for us, perhaps the greatest in the history of this country. It's going to be on all of us, not any one person or candidate or even political party, to make sure that as a country we come through. So I thank you all for everything that you're doing and everything that you're prepared to do going forward. This is my first visit to your community, and again, it's absolutely beautiful. And the pictures we've taken, I'm sending back home to my wife, Amy, who's seeing Avengers Endgame with her kids. She called me yesterday and she said, it's 3 hours long. I don't know if this is one you're going to want to sit through. Do you mind if I just take the kids tomorrow? And I said, go for it. So that's what they're doing right now. But Todd was telling me a little bit about the history of this home as well, and that it was designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. And it goes back, I guess, around 100 years. Amy and I are raising Ulysses, Molly, and Henry in a home that was built a little bit more than 100 years ago in El Paso, Texas, by another student of Frank Lloyd Wright, who built some of the greatest buildings and homes in El Paso, Texas, in our neighborhood of Sunset Heights. His name is Henry Trost. And we live in one of his homes at the corner of Los Angeles and Rio Grande and Yandell Streets in El Paso, Texas. Some people refer to our home as the Pancho Villa house. You may not have known this, but that famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, Mexican revolutionary lived in El Paso, Texas. His nom de guerre was Pancho Villa, but he was born Doroteo Aranga and lived not too far from where Amy and I live. After the revolution, and he was fighting those battles in Chihuahua and beyond, there was a moment where the Chief of Staff of the United States Army came down to El Paso, Texas. Pancho Villa came up to Ciudad Juarez, and they met in the very home that we live in today in our living room to see if they could broker some kind of peace agreement between the United States and Madero and Pancho Villa and the revolutionary forces. They left that meeting thinking that everything had worked out okay. The Army Chief of Staff, Hugh Scott, reported that it was a success. Unfortunately, later in the year, Pancho Villa invaded the United States of America at Columbus, New Mexico. So not all worked out. But I tell you that story to tell you a little bit about the binational nature of the community that we're raising our kids in. El Paso with Ciudad Juarez forms the largest binational community in the Western Hemisphere. There are 3 million of us from these two countries speaking 2 languages with 2 histories, 2 cultures, who are joined, not separated by the Rio Grande River, to form something far greater and more powerful than the sum of our parts or the number of people involved. There's something intangible about it that I tried to show off to Amy when I asked her out on a blind date when she was coming through El Paso, a city she's not from, and took her on that first date to the Kentucky Club in Ciudad Juarez. This is the bar where they invented the margarita, where I like to think Bob Dylan wrote Tom Thumb's Blues, which talks about the streets of Juarez, where maybe Johnny Cash bought his drugs before he was busted for them in El Paso. And it's where Amy and I shared a drink, went to Martino's for dinner, walked down Avenida Juarez to the Customs House, which was the site of a major pivotal moment in the Battle of Juarez during the Revolutionary War, but was also the place that the first time the President of the Republic of Mexico and the President of the Republic of the United States of America ever met. It was there in that customs house, Taft and Diaz. Neither of them needed a translator because they both spoke English and Spanish. They held a reciprocal meeting on our side of the river in El Paso, where Taft broke the chair that he was sitting in. They've saved the pieces of it, I'm told. Went over to the Mission of Guadalupe. It's a mission built by the Spanish 330 years ago, has stood the test of time, the generations that have followed. We took in the sights and the sounds and the smells around us, and it was really one of the best ways for me to introduce Amy to my community. And it's there that we got married, are raising our kids, where they attend world-class public schools, dual language education, where today they learned math in Spanish, tomorrow they'll be learning math in English. They're making the best of living in both worlds, maybe, I hope, twice as competitive as they would be otherwise. And yet it's the very place that Donald Trump wants to make you afraid of. Regardless of the experience that Amy and I and our kids and our friends and our families and those that are represented on city council and Congress have had, despite the fact that El Paso, for 20 years running, has been one of, if not the safest cities in the United States of America. Not despite, but because we are a city of immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees. A quarter of those with whom we live were born in another country. And the way I like to think about it, they chose us. They left their comfort, their family, their language, their homeland to start anew, strangers in a strange land, to do better for themselves and their kids, as we all try to do in our lives with our families, but also because they were called to us to do better for the United States of America, to contribute to our success and to our greatness. And it's hard to argue that they haven't. They have made this one of the greatest, if not the greatest countries the world has ever known. This country, unique amongst the nations of the world, defined not by race or ethnicity or common genealogy, but this idea 243 years strong, that we are all created equal to equal opportunity, the example for the rest of the world. El Paso, Texas, perhaps helps to tell the American story that we are about to lose if we continue to meet children who arrive at our front door, fleeing the deadliest countries on the face of the planet with cages, deporting their moms who risked their very lives across that 2,000-mile journey to bring them here to the very countries from which they fled, to keep those families separated tonight. I think about my 8-year-old son, Henry, and if we showed up in another country where neither of us spoke the language, and upon arrival, he was torn from my arms by force and had not seen me for the last 8 months, what would be going on in his head? I have been there when those families have been reunited by a Catholic charity in El Paso called Annunciation House. And instead of the big goofy smile, which is what Henry meets me with every time I come back from being on the road, impatient to tell me what he's learned, the friends that he's met, the movies that he's seen, those kids have no expression whatsoever on their face. They've got an inability to connect with the person with whom they associate the greatest pain and suffering that a human being can experience. I wonder when, if ever, they're going to open up their hearts again to that person who risked their lives to bring them here in the first place. That is what this country is doing. And not a single one of us can take a single ounce of satisfaction that it's done by one man, Donald Trump, from one party, the Republican Party. For as long as we are a democracy and the people is the government and the government and the government is the people, then this is on every single one of us to make it right. So when I thought about this opportunity to run and serve my country, I thought about this as a defining moment of truth for which I will be judged by my kids. Mom and Dad, when you knew that this was going on, what did you do? Did you just speak out against it? Did you complain? Did you try to vote the right way? Or did you do everything within your power to make it right for us and for every generation that follows? When we encounter the fact that there are tens of millions of our fellow Americans who cannot afford to see a doctor, cannot afford to fill their prescriptions, where the county jail systems in some states, including Texas, is the largest provider of mental health care services today, that those with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and clinical depression so often, too often, are getting arrested on purpose to go to the one place where they're guaranteed care, clothing, food, a roof over their head, a prescription to a medication that will temporarily make life bearable for them. What did we do? When we had an economy that works really well for very few people, for corporations sitting on record piles of cash, but leaves too many others out in the cold. School teachers in Iowa, as well as in Texas, working 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet because their pay in the most important job, unlocking the lifelong love of learning within every single child, is not enough for them to put food on the table or a roof over their head. What did we do? When we knew that this planet had warmed 1 degree Celsius just since 1980, and that was caused not by God, nor by Mother Nature, but by us, our own emissions, our own inaction in the face of the science, the facts, and the truth, and that those floodwaters that are drowning farmers who are already underwater in debt along the Missouri, record flooding levels in Davenport broke the record set in 1993. Houston, Texas, 58 inches of rain fell from the sky in a single storm, the landfall record for as long as we've been keeping them in North America. The fires that we just saw in California that followed epic droughts that preceded them. We've never seen anything like this on the planet. It was brought home to me last week when I was in Yosemite. The oldest living organisms, these gigantic sequoia trees that were born when Caesar ruled the world, are beginning to die. They withstood the test of time for 2,000 years. Every fire, every infestation, every change, they cannot withstand what we are doing today. And what we know is that along this current trajectory, this planet is set to cook another 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 degrees Celsius, after which these floods, fires, and droughts will consume human life and the communities in which we live on a scale and proportion that we cannot even imagine. Those same scientists tell us that there are 10 years left to try to get this right, or at least better for the little people who will follow us. If we can free ourselves from a dependence on fossil fuels, if we can follow farmers who want to be able to make a profit in planting cover crops that pull more carbon out of the air and sequester it into the soil, if we can open up new technologies like precision tilling or no-till farming, if we can ask every single one of us to invest in the technologies that will allow us to take the lead in the world, to convene the other powers of the planet to do their part, then maybe, just maybe, we can avert the worst of crises for Ulysses and Molly and Henry and your kids and grandkids and the generations that follow. But in order to do this, thank you. But in order to do this, it's going to take all of us. These challenges that I just described cannot be met by half measures or half steps or only half the country. It can't be one political party. It can't be big cities versus small towns. It can't be red versus blue. The differences between us, to whom you pray, or whether you pray at all, who it is that you love, how many generations you can count yourself an American, or whether you just got here yesterday, they cannot be allowed to divide us at this defining moment of truth. This country needs to come together. And I know that we can, despite the divisions that are there now. Let me tell you, like Roy, I served in local government on the El Paso City Council for 6 years in a nonpartisan position. I was neither a Democrat nor a Republican. I was an El Paso in charge with delivering for my constituents. Held a town hall every single week where I was accountable to those whom I served, got my best ideas and some tough criticism from them that made me a better public servant. Ran against the odds and against the incumbent to serve in the United States Congress and delivered for my constituents because they also held me accountable. We had the worst wait times for mental health care for veterans in the United States of America. And care delayed became care denied, and and led to an epidemic of veteran suicide in El Paso, and that frankly we see all across the country. We went from dead last to today improving upon the national average, setting some of the national models that we are following across the country, and extending those gains to VAs and veterans nationwide. We did that in the minority by finding common ground and common cause to do the common good with Republicans. And then in Texas, when I ran for the United States Senate, we traveled to each one of the 254 counties in our state. No me importa, did not matter how red or how blue, how big or how small. I went to Pampa, Texas, where Woody Guthrie, who's depicted over here in this painting, worked at the drugstore, bought his first guitar, perhaps composed some of the American masterpieces that would distinguish him and this country, and Pampa, Texas, for that matter. A city so reliably red I had no business showing up, but because Democrats had feared to tread for decades and had not appeared in Pampa, Texas, Republicans didn't have to show up either, and those folks were functionally unrepresented. We showed up to listen to them and learn from them. Going to King County, the reddest county, not in the state of Texas, but in the United States of America, voted for Donald Trump 96% in the last election. As they orbit the Earth and the space station, they can see it glowing red from outer space as a beacon in Texas. We showed up there because I hope you agree, they are every bit as deserving of our respect, of our attention, of being fought for, of being served, of being represented, and we have no hope of delivering for the people of King County if we do not show up first for the people of King County. And though we did not win the race, we lost by 2.6%. We won more votes than any Democrat in the history of the state of Texas, a state that had been 50th in voter turnout in this country. Came out in record levels, young voter turnout up 500% over the last midterm election. 2 new members of Congress, both Democrats, replacing Republicans, helping to flip the House of Representatives. We changed the composition of our state legislature, and 17 African American women won election to judicial positions in Harris County, the most diverse county in the United States of America, literally changing the face of criminal justice in the process. We won independence for the first time in a decade, and 500,000 Republicans who voted for a very conservative Tea Party, Donald Trump-friendly governor on that same ballot voted for me. And we never had to cut our sails or trim our sails or show up with anything less than the courage of our convictions. And the kicker is, my mom, a lifelong Republican, also voted for me in 2000. So we won her over. So look, I know that we have our work cut out for us, but I know from my experience, I know from your experiences, I know from just listening to Todd right now, that we can do this. We can do this. It's going to take all of us, but we can absolutely do this. But it's got to be in the process of bringing this country together, not separating, not dividing, not defining ourselves by our differences, instead by our ambitions, our aspirations, the work, the service, the sacrifice we will bring to bear in order to see them through. Thank you all for having me out here today. Very grateful.
Hola. Jaime. Muchas personas allí se llaman Beto.
Sí.
Bienvenidos, Ciudad de Carlos.
Gracias.
Diversity is our strength. We have Congressman Steve King as our. What can we do to change that to make it more welcoming in our country?
Yeah. I think about this a lot. As I shared with you the story of El Paso, the facts, the truth flies in the face of the incredibly hateful rhetoric used by Steve King and by Donald Trump. Not only are Mexican immigrants not rapists and criminals, they commit violent crimes at a lower rate than those who are born in this country. Asylum seekers described by our president as animals and an infestation. An infestation is how you talk about a cockroach, something subhuman, a word that you might expect to be used in the Third Reich, but not in the United States of America in 2018 and 2019. Klansmen, white supremacists, Nazis, our president says, are very fine people. And he tweeted out a video conflating a Muslim member of Congress, Ilhan Omar, with the attackers on 9/11, inspiring even more Islamophobia and paranoia and hatred and fear and attacks. Because in the last 3 years, not only has this rhetoric offended our sensibility and our ears, it's also led to a rise in hate crimes every single one of those years. The day that the president signed an executive order seeking to ban Muslim travel to the United States of America, the mosque in Victoria, Texas was burned to the ground. So there's a real cost and consequence to the language that he uses. You don't get kids in cages until they're first defined as something other than human. So what is our response to this? One, we call it out where we find it, and we describe it in very real, direct, honest terms. That is racism in its purest form, and it's coming from the highest office in the land. We make sure that we reverse these policies once in office, no longer separating families, reuniting them with every effort we can possibly muster, rewriting our immigration laws in our own image to reflect what you just said, which is that we shouldn't be tolerating or respecting our differences. We should be embracing them. It's the very source of our strength. It's what makes us exceptional in the world and in world history. And to turn our back on that is to turn our back on our future, to literally wall ourselves off from the rest of the world and to deny any chance for the generations that follow us to enjoy the prosperity and the indispensable nature of this country on the world stage that we've enjoyed for decades, for centuries so far. So I want to make sure in the rhetoric that we employ, the policies that we pursue, the practices of the next administration, we not only confront the negativity that we have seen, but we describe a much more powerful, positive, ambitious future for this country. Thanks for asking the question. Yes, sir.
It appears that Donald Trump is goading the Democrats in the House of Representatives into actually impeaching him. He's gone out of his way. His latest move, Steve Mnuchin, refused to allow Trump's tax returns to be president. That's against the law. There's a law that goes back to the Teapot Dome scandal.
There you go.
That says they must do that. And he is breaking the law. So it seems like they are just goading him because they think that's going to be a winning situation for them because they know they will not be convicted in the Senate. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, really, really good question. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that A.B. Fall, Secretary of the Interior during the Teapot Dome scandal, briefly lived in El Paso, Texas. So to all of us here. I've thought a lot about this because you're right to ask, what does the president want us to do? Or maybe I shouldn't say us, what does he want Democrats in the Congress to do right now? And are Democrats in the Congress playing right in to his plan or to his strategy? But I also think about what I hope is a larger question, which is the fact that this president invited the participation of a foreign power into our elections. That is beyond dispute. On a stage, he said, Russia, if you're listening, I hope that you will find Hillary Clinton's emails. That very same day, Russia began work on finding Hillary Clinton's emails. After the Mueller report was delivered, one of his first calls was to Vladimir Putin, with whom he spent an hour on the phone and described the results of the investigation as a hoax, which means that he's doing nothing to defend this democracy and the sanctity of the ballot box against the next attack from that country. His obstruction of justice, which is clear as day to me, whether you take it from firing James Comey, the principal investigator into what happened, or his tweeting in broad daylight again to Jeff Sessions to end the Russia investigation. If there are not consequences, if there's not accountability, if there's not justice, this is not only a green light for Russia to continue to interfere, it's a green light for this administration and future administrations to believe that they are above the law in a country that is supposed to be defined by rule of law. When you have an attorney general who refuses to testify to Congress, or a secretary who refuses to furnish the tax records, though it is the law of the land that the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee can demand the tax records of any single American, you are provoking a constitutional showdown in this country. And if we are found wanting, if we blink, if we turn our back on this because of the political inconvenience or the polling or the next election, this democracy, this exception in world history, I believe will begin to unravel. We need a moment not unlike that followed Watergate, where Republicans as well as Democrats put this country above their prospects in the next election, above what is popular, above how these things poll. So I do want to make sure that Congress does its part. I agree with you that there may be political peril in doing so, but if we fail to do that, I really worry that we begin, even more than we have already, to slide down this path that leads to another form of government altogether. So thanks for asking the question. Appreciate it.
My name is Randy Cross, I live in Charles City. I just wanted to ask you what you thought of socialism, and what do you think of Cortez's Green New Deal and all the free stuff, which I like, but how would we pay for it? Through tax increases or?
So on the first question,
Yes.
when I moved back to El Paso in the late 90s, I was very fortunate to be able to start a business with good friends in that community, one of the poorest urban counties in the United States of America. We started a high-tech company with high-wage, high-skill jobs. So I know what it's like to create jobs, know what it's like to meet a payroll. I know what it's like to work within our capitalism and see success and innovate and bring ingenuity to market. So I believe in capitalism, but I believe in a far more conscientious capitalism than the one that we are practicing today. Our capitalism right now shuts out so many people from the kind of opportunity that I enjoyed. So many people who are consigned to poverty, perhaps based on where they live, or given the fact that there's 10 times the wealth in white America than there is in black America, and that is not an accident. That was on purpose from the very beginning and founding of this country. We really have our work cut out for us to bring more people in. I also think that if we're going to meet any of the challenges that I just described, and the most important one being climate, it cannot be simply government driven or mandated. We're going to have to unlock the innovation that will come out of capitalism, the small business owners who will test, take risk, and bring ideas to market that will allow us to meet this challenge. So I think that's the way to approach your first question. On your second question, I love the Green New Deal because it is ambitious. It speaks to our sense of history and purpose. It calls to mind the last great era of sacrifice and service from the greatest generation. Emerging from the Great Depression, they met the existential threat to the Western democracies of Nazi Germany, and they marshaled this country, hundreds of millions, through our democracy and led the other Western democracies in that fight. I read this great book, and I'm blanking on the name of the author. Someone here will know it, Citizen Soldiers. And it talks about these young men from all over America, many of them farm boys, as he calls them, who are out there fixing the tanks in the field because they fixed the tractors in the field right here. This democracy, and it was an open question whether democracy could marshal the forces necessary to do this, made the world safe for democracy for the next 80 years. We have an existential threat even greater right now when it comes to climate. And so yes, the government must be incredibly ambitious in what it funds, in what it orchestrates, but we must also ask the private sector to do its part, and I believe that they will, and I believe also that we can elevate those communities who have borne the brunt of climate change. I think about Pacific Junction that we just visited, I think about Davenport, I think about other communities in Iowa, and I think about lower income and communities of color that so often have the most polluted air and polluted water in the United States of America. They should be first in being able to embrace the economic opportunities of wind and solar and a transitional economy that leaves fossil fuels behind to embrace clean energy going forward. So you may or may not know, we released a plan last week that meets the ambition of the Green New Deal by calling for a $5 trillion investment over the next 10 years, using every authority within the executive branch, whether it's procurement or leasing on public lands or re-signing the Paris Climate Accords, to make sure that this country is meeting its commitment to this generation and every generation that follows. Thanks for the question.
I just want to say, you're a great citizen, you just want to get my vote.
Wonderful, yes. Thank you, I hope to earn it, yes. Stephen Ambrose was the author of Citizen Soldiers, thank you.
I'm looking for a candidate who reminds me of Todd, who will go to DC and fight for me the way Todd fought and advocated for me personally at the Iowa Capitol. I've been living with HIV for 25 years now, and I have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly in healthcare. Actually, the ugly was in Texas when I lived there. In the last 5 years, I've been really what I call reclaiming milestones, events that I was never supposed to live long enough to see. But I am here because we have made the advances in treatment and care. So the first was, I wasn't supposed to live long enough to see my son graduate. I was there to see him walk across the stage in 2015. I never was supposed to be able to see him get married. He escorted me down the aisle on September 1st, 2018. And the last was, I never imagined that I would live long enough to see my grandkids. And my Henry is 3 months old, and I'm here to spoil them, but that is because we have invested in research and development, and I have had access, except for those 3 years in Texas, I have had access to health care. So what are you going to do for people living with HIV so that we can access quality, affordable health care that saves our lives?
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story to make the case to all of us about the opportunity before us. Wealthiest, most powerful country, most technologically and medically advanced. This is ours. Ours to win or ours to lose. Investing in the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, making drugs like PEP and PrEP available to people all over this country, no questions asked. Investing in the cures that are there for us to find, not only for HIV/AIDS, for other conditions like Alzheimer's that are within reach, and if we fail to find the cures, are going to be exponentially more expensive to treat and take care of over the long term. And then making sure, to your final question about health care, that we guarantee everyone high quality care in this country without exception. And what we know right now is that beyond the tens of millions who have no care at all, and the fact that diabetes still claims lives 97 years after insulin was invented in the wealthiest country, that folks are dying of curable cancers and of the flu in the United States of America. We have people who are underinsured or have insufficient insurance, that cannot afford their premiums or bridge their deductibles or make their co-pays, and they're suffering and in some cases dying as a result. The answer to this is a program that enrolls every single American who's not cared for today in Medicare. Everyone who has insufficient insurance today elects to move to Medicare if they choose. But those who have employer-sponsored insurance and like it because it works for them and for their families are able to keep that. For me, that is the surest, quickest, most affordable path to get to the goal that you and I share. That idea was actually introduced in the House of Representatives by two women that I used to serve with, Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut and Jan Schakowsky from Illinois. I believe there is enough common ground there with Democrats, but also independents and even Republicans to ensure that we can make it a reality sooner rather than later. Thank you for asking the question.
We have time for one more.
Okay, Cynthia says we have time for one more question, and it'll be you. Yeah.
I'm Jennifer from town Western New Hampton. I just want to say thank you for doing what you're doing. It really, I never used to get involved in politics at all until Barack Obama came along, and boy, I was inspired. And I get that same inspiration and hopefulness from you. And so Iowa is very important. I just want you to keep doing what you're doing, hit these small spots. We appreciate it. You know, we're the ones that are gonna vote. We're not, you know, even though I listen to MSNBC, but we're not MSNBC, CNN that say, you think he's too socialist, you think he's too Democrat, you think he's too Republican. It's the people that are listening to you and the people that are gonna, you know, vote for you. Iowa is so important. Just wanna say thank you for what you're doing and keep it up, and we got your back.
All right. That that was so nice of you to say. I really appreciate it. I hope the MSNBC camera picked that up. And you got, we will continue to campaign this way. We find the greatest joy in being with people, learning from them, reflecting the stories that we just heard back on the campaign trail. Because it makes the case to our fellow Americans about this moment and what we're able to do to meet it. So thank you for that. Ann and Todd, thank you for having us in your home, and to each of you, thanks for coming out. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to have my back to you for so much.